The final cause of death was established as a gunshot wound to the abdomen-chest.
And he was declared dead pretty shortly thereafter. I mean, they worked on him, but
Right.
within within like 30 minutes of the shooting, he was declared dead. So it was not much they could do for him.
For years, the world has wondered about the nurse who was inside the room when Biggie took his final breath, and now the silence around his last moments is finally cracking open. What she reveals about the notorious B.I.G. is deeply emotional in a way that hits straight into the darkest part of the story, because his so-called last words exposed the brutal final seconds of a legend slipping away while everything around him fell completely silent. The party was supposed to be another victory lap for Biggie. The music was loud, celebrities were everywhere, cameras flashing non-stop outside the Soul Train Awards after party in Los Angeles. On the surface, it looked like the East Coast King had survived everything. The drama, the rap war, the pressure, the paranoia after Tupac Shakur was killed just months earlier. But underneath all of that, Biggie was not in great physical shape. That part rarely gets talked about. Just months before his murder, he had been in a serious car accident that left him with a rod placed in his leg. He had trouble moving around. Friends said he was walking with a cane. And according to the autopsy report later released, he weighed around 395 pounds at the time of his death. Even the coroner noted he had an enlarged heart. So while the world still saw the untouchable superstar, his body was already struggling before a single bullet was fired that night. That detail makes everything that happened next feel even darker. Outside the party, the streets were packed with cars trying to leave the area. Biggie was sitting inside the SUV with his crew, trapped in traffic. Then came the moment that would freeze hip-hop history forever. Witnesses said another vehicle pulled alongside them at a red light. Seconds later, gunfire exploded through the night.
All right, well, the final cause of death was established as a gunshot wound to the abdomen-chest. And the other conditions, which is things that might not directly relate to the death of the person in terms of what was fatal, they indicate that there was multiple non-fatal wounds.
And almost instantly, the attention of the world locked onto the shooting itself. The mystery of the killer, the East Coast-West Coast tension, the conspiracy theories. But very few people focused on what happened after Biggie was rushed away from that scene. Because the hospital story is where things become genuinely haunting. Years later, people connected to the coroner's office and emergency response started discussing what happened when Biggie arrived at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. And the details were brutal. The hospital reportedly already knew a gunshot victim was coming in before the SUV even arrived. Trauma teams were preparing for catastrophic injuries. But when doctors finally got him inside, the situation was already collapsing fast. According to the medical findings, Biggie arrived in ventricular fibrillation. That means his heart was no longer beating at a normal rhythm. In simple terms, his body was shutting down. Then came the detail that hit people the hardest when the records became public. Doctors reportedly never got a pulse from him, not once. The hospital logs showed no blood pressure and no pulse from the moment he arrived. Medical staff worked on him anyway for close to half an hour, refusing to give up. And that's the part that stays with people. Because inside that trauma room, nobody was looking at a rap icon anymore. They were looking at a dying 24-year-old man fighting catastrophic internal injuries.
Perforating injuries to things like the ascending colon, the liver, right hemidiaphragm, pericardium, heart and upper lobe of the left lung, and the bullet was recovered from the left shoulder area.
Nurses were reportedly cutting away clothing while doctors shouted instructions across the room. Machines were screaming, blood everywhere. Emergency staff trying every possible procedure to force life back into his body. And the autopsy later explained exactly why the damage was almost impossible to survive. The fatal bullet didn't simply hit one area and stop. It traveled upward from the abdomen into the chest, tearing through multiple organs along the way. The report described damage to the colon, liver, diaphragm, heart, and lung before the bullet finally stopped near the left shoulder area. That is an insane amount of trauma for the body to absorb in seconds. One former coroner investigator later explained something chilling about gunshot wounds. Sometimes the bullet itself is not even the worst part. It's the path it takes through the body that becomes deadly. And in Biggie's case, the path was devastating. But this is where the mystery around the last word starts getting emotional.
And then in the autopsy report, Dr. Sheinin will break that down, and depending on how many projectiles she recovers at autopsy, she'll identify each one, where it was recovered from, and then also outline what was damaged by that bullet, because bullets sometimes travel through other organs and do a lot of damage on their way to their final destination.
Over the years, quiet rumors started floating around about whether Biggie briefly tried to respond while being transported or while doctors worked on him. Nothing fully confirmed. No dramatic movie-style final speech, but enough whispers from people around the case to keep the question alive for decades. Some people connected to the hospital later suggested the medical staff never forgot his expression that night. Others hinted there may have been attempted speech, small reactions, or moments where it looked like he was trying to say something before slipping away completely. And honestly, that's what makes this story so disturbing. Not the conspiracy theories, not even the gunshots. It's the thought of one of the biggest rappers on earth lying in a trauma room surrounded by strangers and scrubs, possibly aware for a few terrifying moments that his life was ending. The official records show doctors kept trying everything they could. At one point, they even performed intercardiac massage, physically attempting to stimulate the heart directly. That's how desperate the situation became. But nothing worked. The final hospital readings reportedly showed zeros across the board. No pulse, no blood pressure, no recovery. And within less than an hour of the shooting, the notorious B.I.G. was gone. That's the part history usually skips over. The silence after the chaos, the trauma room, the exhausted nurses, the doctors realizing they were losing one of the most famous artists alive right in front of them. And years later, when pieces of those hospital details finally started coming out, people realized the real horror of Biggie's final moments was not just the attack outside. It was how hopeless everything became once he reached the hospital. And this is where the story stops feeling like a celebrity mystery and starts feeling terrifyingly real.
And again, like I said earlier, the bullets don't always go straight to the kill zone.
Right.
They travel through things, and sometimes the traveling through will increase the lethality of the gunshot wound rather than its final destination.
Sure.
Because once the autopsy report finally surfaced years later, people realized Biggie's death was far more brutal than the headlines ever made it sound. Most people heard drive-by shooting and assumed it was one quick fatal shot. Clean, instant, Hollywood style. Nope. The actual medical report reads like something emergency room doctors probably still remember decades later. And first of all, this thing was massive. 97 pages. That is not normal. Even the former coroner investigator admitted that was unusually long. But this wasn't treated like some ordinary homicide case. This was one of the biggest stars on earth getting assassinated in public while the entire music industry was already on edge after Tupac Shakur. Everybody knew this case was radioactive from the second it happened, so investigators went deep. And when they started tracing the actual path of the fatal bullet, things got ugly fast. The bullet didn't just strike one area and stop. It basically went on a destructive road trip through his body. Seriously, the path is horrifying. According to the autopsy, the fatal wound traveled upward from the abdomen into the chest, and on its way there, it tore through multiple organs like a wrecking ball. The ascending colon was perforated. The liver is severely damaged. The diaphragm was penetrated. The pericardium, which is basically the protective sac around the heart, damaged too. Then the heart itself got hit. That's why doctors later believed he likely died within minutes of being shot. By the time they got him to the hospital, the damage had already triggered catastrophic failure inside his body. And yet the emergency room staff still fought for him anyway. That part gets emotional because when you read the hospital timeline, you can almost feel the desperation inside that room. The first vital signs recorded were around 12:46 in the morning. Then more entries followed. 12:50. 12:55. Past 1 a.m. and every single update told the same heartbreaking story. At one point, doctors performed something called intercardiac massage. Now, if that sounds intense, that's because it is. That literally means physically massaging the heart with their hands in an attempt to restart it. Think about how serious the situation has to become before trained surgeons are manually trying to force someone's heart back to life. That's not routine emergency care anymore. That's pure desperation. And honestly, there's something deeply sad about the contrast here. This is the notorious Big, one of the biggest rappers in the world. Platinum records, millions of fans, one of the most recognizable voices in music history. But inside that trauma room, none of that mattered. Fame could not stop blood loss, money could not repair shredded organs, and celebrity status definitely could not change the fact that doctors were staring at injuries most people simply do not survive. And the coroner's office understood immediately that this case was different. This wasn't treated like some random street homicide where paperwork gets rushed through by the end of the week. Investigators reportedly pulled out all the stops. The phrase kept coming up because the circumstances were so shocking. Biggie was not in a gang shootout standing on some dark corner.
The placement of a tube may not be where you think it is. And sometimes something might have more of a role to play in the death than what was originally thought. So that's why we say don't pull out the IV lines, leave the IV lines, you can clamp them, whatever you need to do.
He had just left a major industry event surrounded by celebrities and security. Then suddenly, he's dead. That changes everything. The LAPD quickly placed what they called a security hold on the case. And basically that meant almost nobody was allowed to publicly discuss details while detectives tried to chase leads. Even people inside the coroner's office were told not to speak to the media. And honestly, that probably made the mystery even bigger. Because when information disappears, rumors grow 10 times faster. People started filling in blanks with conspiracy theories, rap war narratives, secret revenge plots, all of that. But buried underneath the headlines and rumors was the ugly medical reality sitting quietly inside those 97 pages. A 24-year-old man arrived at the hospital with catastrophic internal injuries. Doctors fought for nearly half an hour. They never got a pulse back. And despite every effort, there was simply too much damage. That's the part people forget when they reduce Biggie's death to just another hip-hop conspiracy. The autopsy tells a much colder story. Not mythology, not rumors. Just a body that had suffered devastating trauma and a room full of exhausted medical staff slowly realizing there was nothing left they could do. And then the story got even stranger after the hospital part was over. Because years later, the internet started circulating photos that people were probably never supposed to see in the first place. Some of the images showed the notorious Big after his death with medical tubes and IV lines still attached to his body. And when people first saw those photos online, a lot of them had the same reaction. Wait, why didn't the hospital remove all of that? At first glance, it looks unsettling, almost careless, like the doctors just left everything there and walked away. But according to former coroner officials, there's actually a very serious reason for that.
Well, the coroner asked that once a person's been pronounced dead, nobody is allowed to touch the body or do anything with the body.
Once a person is officially pronounced dead, the body basically becomes part of an investigation. And from that moment on, doctors and nurses are not supposed to start removing things, adjusting things, or cleaning things up before the coroner examines everything exactly as it was. And honestly, the reason why is kind of disturbing, because sometimes the treatment itself becomes part of the investigation. Yeah. The coroner investigator explained that tube placement matters. IV lines matter, medical procedures matter. If something was inserted incorrectly or a complication happened during treatment, investigators need to see it exactly the way it was at the moment of death. That's why they leave everything attached, because legally and medically, every detail matters. And then the former investigator dropped one of the coldest phrases imaginable. The coroner apparently has a term for situations where medical treatment accidentally contributes to somebody's death. They call it a therapeutic misadventure, which honestly sounds way too cheerful for what it actually means. That phrase basically translates to, the treatment may have gone wrong. Now, to be clear, investigators specifically said that was not believed to be the case with Biggie. Nobody was saying the hospital caused his death. His injuries were catastrophic long before he reached Cedars-Sinai. But the reason they preserve everything is because hospitals can become part of investigations if questions later come up. And suddenly those haunting photos online make a lot more sense. The tubes, the tape still attached to his face, the IV lines. That wasn't random. That was procedure. And weirdly enough, the more people learned about the medical side of the case, the sadder the whole thing became. Because instead of feeling like this larger-than-life rap legend, Biggie started feeling painfully human. Then came another detail from the autopsy that completely shocked people: the toxicology report. Now be honest. If somebody told you one of the biggest rappers alive had just left a major party in Los Angeles during the peak of 90s hip-hop excess, what would you probably assume? Most people would say alcohol was definitely involved. Maybe harder drugs too. Champagne everywhere, weed smoke in the air, celebrities partying till sunrise. That was the image attached to Biggie for years. But according to the toxicology findings, there was reportedly no alcohol and no hard drugs detected in his system. Nothing. That genuinely surprised a lot of people, because the public version of Biggie was larger than life. Big dinners, big parties, big energy, and friends openly talked about him loving marijuana. So naturally, people expected the toxicology report to come back looking chaotic. Instead, it was basically clean. And this led to one oddly funny exchange from the former coroner investigator when they discussed why marijuana wasn't even a major focus during testing. He explained that the coroner mainly checks for substances that directly contribute to death or dangerous impairment. Cocaine? Important. Alcohol poisoning? Important. But marijuana? His explanation was darkly hilarious. You don't die from marijuana, you die from walking in front of a bus while you're high. Which is probably the most coroner way possible to explain toxicology priorities. But underneath the humor was an important point. The findings destroyed the idea that Biggie was stumbling around recklessly intoxicated that night. There was no evidence suggesting he was out of control or too impaired to understand what was happening. And honestly, that makes the whole thing even more tragic, because it means this was not some reckless overdose situation or a celebrity partying too hard. This was targeted violence. And the sad reality is, Biggie was already dealing with serious physical problems before the shooting even happened. That part gets overlooked constantly. Months before his death, he had survived a serious car accident that left him badly injured. Doctors had to place a rod in his leg, and according to people around him, he was still struggling to move comfortably near the end of his life. That's why he had started using a cane. Think about how surreal that is for a second. One of the biggest rappers on earth was only 24 years old and already walking around like somebody decades older because his body had been through so much damage. Then the autopsy added even more context. The report mentioned morbid obesity and an enlarged heart condition. And while those findings were not the direct cause of death, medical experts acknowledged they likely made surviving catastrophic trauma even harder. Basically, his body was already under pressure before the shooting. And there's something deeply tragic about the timing of all this, because Biggie was not spiraling downward when he died. In a lot of ways, he was trying to rebuild. The East Coast-West Coast tension had already turned deadly after Tupac Shakur. The entire rap world felt paranoid, dangerous, exhausted, and Biggie seemed ready to move forward from it. His career was exploding globally. His music was evolving. He was becoming bigger than rap at that point. But physically, he was worn down. The cane, the injuries, the enlarged heart, the weight issues, the exhaustion from nonstop fame. And then suddenly, before any real healing could happen, his life ended in a hospital trauma room with doctors trying desperately to stop the damage spreading through his body. That's why the autopsy hits people differently once they actually read the details, because it stops feeling like mythology and starts feeling heartbreakingly real. Even after all these years, one thing about this case still feels unfinished. Not just unsolved, but almost frozen in time. Because right after the shooting, everything tightened up. Security holds went in place. Officials stayed quiet. Detectives kept information locked down while they chased leads that, even today, never fully formed into a clear answer. And that silence created its own problem. When official answers disappear, rumors rush in to fill the space. That's exactly what happened here. People started connecting dots between the biggest losses in hip-hop history, especially the deaths of Tupac Shakur and the notorious Big. Two icons, two cities, two shootings that changed rap forever. But even with all the comparisons, the truth is still simpler and more frustrating. There was never a clean ending, no clear public resolution that made people say, okay, now it all makes sense. And that's why this case refuses to fade. Because Biggie didn't just disappear in some abstract celebrity way. He went from a live moment in traffic to a hospital bed where everything stopped working within minutes. And then the story just breaks apart. That gap is what keeps people stuck on it. The gunshots are only the beginning. The real weight of the story is everything that came after, especially when the hospital records and autopsy details started leaking into public view. That's when Biggie stopped being just a rap legend in people's minds and started becoming something much more human. The autopsy, the hospital records, and those final minutes prove something completely different. Even legends don't get to negotiate with time. And in Biggie's case, everything ended not with a final verse or a final performance, but with machines slowly going silent one by one in a room that had already realized the story was over.